Well, here we go with chapter 12, Delivering Your Speech. Um, I constantly fuss about this book. I think this should have been like chapter 12 or 2 or something, but here it is. Also, please remember that I have gone through uh, almost all the information that is in chapter 12 about delivering your speech right at the beginning of the semester. So, my slides are available for review. I think it was called Successful Speaking, is the one where I covered most of this. So I'm just going to do a fairly quick review using chapter 12. I'm also, as you can see, using the publisher's slides. Again, you can go back and look at my slides to review this in more detail. So, delivering your speech. All right, I've already given this presentation, selecting a delivery method. And as I said before, there are 4 basic types of methods to give your speech, ways to give a speech: impromptu, extemporaneous, manuscript, and memorized. Okay, and of course, for this class, there's only one method that I'm interested in you becoming proficient, practicing, and so on, and that's extemporaneous speaking. Remember, impromptu speaking, that's where it's just off the top of your head. You're at an event and someone says, "Hey, Ray, stand up and say a few words about blah, blah, blah." Okay, that's impromptu speaking. I'm not prepared. Still have to try to organize my thoughts before I launch into it. But basically, it's just off the top of my head, on the fly, however you might want to express it. Manuscript speaking, remember what that is? That's where you write your speech out word for word and then stand at a podium and read the speech. Now, the next slide talks about advantages and disadvantages. There are times where you want to have the words exactly as you have written them. Eulogies are a potential example. I have found over the years that even when I've tried to write out a speech word for word, I tend to fall back into the extemporaneous mode. I feel that it is absolutely the best way to deliver a presentation. And of course, memorized, I don't need to say much about that. Memorization is if you really need something to be exactly right and you want to make good eye contact and look at your audience, well, then memorize it. But for this class, for all the speeches, all 4 of them: the dramatic reading, the self-introductory speech, the informative, and the persuasive speech, they all need to have some level of extemporaneous presentation. All right, so here's the slide with the advantages and disadvantages, and again, it's very similar to what I posted in my presentation about delivery methods for uh, the 4 different methods. Uh, you can look this over. Of course, it's in the book as well, but it's very, very similar to what I've already presented. Okay, this chapter, and it's not a real long chapter. This chapter also talks about other influences on the delivery of the speech, and we're talking about the speaker themselves: culture, gender, fluency, dialect, physical impairments, and just briefly, of course, culture is an obvious one. And in the book, they use some examples of uh, what the expectations are in different cultures for their speakers. They mention in uh, Asia, for example, it's not well accepted for a speaker to get up and carry on about their own achievements. All right. Whereas in English speaking, especially America and Britain, and I think Europe as a whole, uh, one of the ways we tend to establish ethos is to do just that. We talk about what we've done. We talk about why you should listen to me. etc., etc. So the culture you grow up in is going to affect the way you deliver your speech. And again, a speech that you might listen to in Mexico or Venezuela or some South American country example may be very different in delivery than a speech that you would hear here in America. I know I've watched YouTube videos of. I love watching parliaments in different countries, and the delivery method and the reactions are so utterly different from culture to culture. So it does make a difference, and you need to be aware of that. If you grew up in a different culture, you're going to approach giving your speech differently. That's fine. You just need to be aware of it. Gender. And again, this chapter goes into the disparity between the way men and women are perceived, and in this particular case, of course, as speakers. And the book points out studies that have been done that men tend to be perceived more as authorities than women when they get up to give a speech. It depends on the setting. I found it interesting in the chapter that they say that in college classes, that college students don't seem to have the same disparity between genders, men and women, as recognizing them as authorities on whatever they're talking about. My mother, who passed away at 90, uh, was always much more influenced by the men in her lives than the women. Unfortunately, my father passed away when I was fairly young, and for the rest of her life, if I told her something was important, she'd listen. If my sister, who was only a year and a half younger than me, told her the same thing, not always. So we have this built in uh, bias in gender. And of course, a lot of it is generational. And I think it is that generational attitude is changing because as an old fart professor in communications, I really see that in the classes, and it makes me happy that we are seeing a change there. But again, if you're in a mixed audience, mixed age groups, you need to be aware that if you're a woman speaking on a topic, you may have to approach it a little differently, more forcefully, whatever, to feel confident that your entire audience is accepting it the way you would like to have it accepted. Fluency, language. I know, especially here at CSM, we have a lot of English as a second language students. And so fluency is often uh, a stumbling block, if you like, for a lot of speakers in these classes. They feel unsure of themselves about the way they pronounce the words and their delivery. Once again, I talked about methods of slowing down. I had someone send me an email early on in the course saying that they speak very quickly, and my response always is, and this is kind of my catch-all response: breathe. If you force yourself to think about your breathing, even if English is not your first language, it will help you slow down. People will understand you better. And that goes into dialect again, uh, and then physical impairments. One of the most famous examples of a world leader before our time who had a terrible speech impediment through stuttering was the father of Queen Elizabeth. He stuttered horrifically, and he actually employed a speech coach who helped him. They became lifelong friends until he passed away, George VI, I believe it was. And he found ways to overcome that particular impediment. Of course, there's other issues. Uh, Sight impediment, visually impaired, which I identify with a lot more since my issues, which means reading your notes, or if you're using visual aids, could create an issue for you. How do you deal with it? It's all summed up in one word: practice. Make sure that whatever your situation may be, that you've practiced enough that you have strategies to deal with any real or even imagined impediments, such as stage fright. So, culture, gender, fluency, dialect, physical impairments, these are all issues that can affect the way a speaker delivers their speech and how effectively they deliver the speech. Once more, I've already talked about all this. Just summarize it. Breathing. Do you remember the 3 breathing methods? Okay, there was what? Diaphragmatic breathing, which is the one, get a good gut breath going. I'm doing that right now, even though I'm sitting down. Meditation breathing. Before you get up to speak, if you're nervous, think about your breathing. Think about the rhythm of your breathing. And then, of course, that tension release breathing, where you take those quick kind of breathings and just almost shake it out the end of your fingers. Just don't do that at the podium. All right. Once again, your breathing will also help you accomplish speaking loudly enough, and then maintaining a good rhythm and so on to your speech, so that you're not speaking too quickly. Avoid vocalized pauses. I haven't talked about this. In my mind, what this means, and of course, it depends on the instructor. We all tend to use filler words. Like, actually. That's one I tend to use. Those are all vocalized pauses. They're filler words. Instead of just stopping, taking a pause, catching your breath, getting your thoughts in order, we use vocalized pauses. And they're really annoying. You want to avoid that as much as you can. It's perfectly all right to pause. People will wait for you, as long as you don't pause for an indefinite period of time. People will happily wait for you. A pause, an actual physical pause where you're quiet for a moment, not only helps you, but it helps your audience too. Because remember, they're trying to keep up with what you're talking about. So don't use visualized pauses, actually we do that all the time because we don't know exactly what we're going to say next. So you know how we okay, oh God, those are all vocalized pauses. All right. And then articulate clearly and accurately. It goes right back to breathing. If you slow down and breathe well, you will pronounce your words well. Even if you have an accent, people will understand you. So slow down. This whole slide, these 5 bullet points here, go right back to my 3 rules of public speaking, and in particular, all 5 of these can be dealt with rule number 3: slow down. Also, managing your body, dress for the occasion. I haven't talked much about that because we're in a situation where, with online teaching and everyone providing me with video recorded presentations, it doesn't seem to be as much of an issue. But as I mentioned before, if you find yourself in a situation where you need to get up in front of a group, there's that old phrase, dress for success. Don't be afraid to dress nicely. That doesn't mean you need to wear a dress or a suit and tie, but at least dress comfortably and nicely. And the audience will certainly connect with you for that reason. Face the audience? Well, yeah, duh. You got to look at your audience and make eye contact. Now, there is a caveat here. And once again, we're not doing this, but in class for the informative and persuasive speeches, I would have you do PowerPoint, Prezi, whatever, Google Slides, so that you have visual aids as well. There's an old rule of thumb in the theater that you never turn your back on the audience. Same thing in public speaking. If you're ever using visual aids in a presentation at work, wherever it might be, don't turn and face the screen. You have to be able to look and you know organize yourself so that you can easily look over at those slides and talk about them, but that you're not turning your back on the audience. It all comes back to eye contact. If you don't look at your audience, what have I said before? They're going to think you don't care. And then display appropriate facial expressions. Okay, smile. And that's hard, I didn't comment on this with, for example, with the dramatic readings, but I've had people just, stand there and just read it without any facial expression at all. This is where, when you practice, oh God, uh, look in the mirror and see what you see yourself doing. And that's kind of what's happening with me now, recording all of these. Of course, I have my little screen down in the corner, and it's exactly like looking in a mirror. I'm watching myself speak. It's kind of a weird situation because that's not the norm when you're up in front of a group, is it? But one of the aspects that it has helped me with is I realize I can have a very deadpan face. So I need to smile sometimes, raise my eyebrows, open my eyes a little wider. All of these things tells your audience uh, that you are invested in what you're doing, that you're just not up there and waiting to get it over with. All right. Okay. Manage or have good posture. Remember in my lecture about stage fright, I talked about fight or flight, and that when you get nervous, you tend to hunch and do this sort of thing. You have to really physically think about standing up straight and having good posture. Also, just the act of standing up straight is going to help you breathe better. It really will. Move with purpose and spontaneity. Don't just stand there gripping a podium. You can move around a little bit. That's part of extemporaneous speaking. You don't want to pace though, and I've seen speakers that do that. They pace, or it almost like they move from foot to foot and that sort of thing. You don't want to do that, but you don't want to just stand there like a statue either. Avoid physical barriers. What does that mean? Uh, when we're in class giving speeches, typically we have a podium, and most of the classrooms at CSN have these nice little podiums that are just pedestal podiums. But anything you stand behind when you're speaking becomes a barrier, becomes almost a safety net between you and your audience. Make sure you don't make that a true barrier. Don't be afraid to step aside a little bit from the podium as you're speaking. That goes back to a bit of body movement and so on. But don't use that podium or some other a desk or whatever it may be as a true physical barrier between you and your audience, because you don't want to create that sense of disconnection. Again, remember, being connected to your audience is your most effective way to get your message across. All right, and then adjust to the speaking space. Again, classroom, auditorium, wherever it might be. Involve the audience. And you have teachers, and of course, if we were in a classroom, I'd be asking you. In fact, I'm pretty good about learning people's names in the classroom setting fairly quickly, and I'll call on people. So classroom's a prime example of involving your audience. Can you do that in a speech? Or you can do it where you ask a rhetorical question, and you may see people raising your or shaking their heads, or even some verbal feedback. Yeah, that's right. Uh, you can even say, "Let me ask you a question. Raise your hand if this has ever happened to you." There's different ways to involve your audience. And of course, accommodating audience members with impairments. I may have used this example before, but when I worked in planetariums, I, on occasion, had situations where I would have hearing impaired come into the planetarium. If you've ever been to a planetarium show, you know it's really dark. The whole idea is to see the stars. And so we had to find ways to use red lights where a signer could work and overcome those situations. I've even had visually impaired groups come to the planetarium and had to find ways to let them experience the dark night sky. It can be a real challenge. In most cases, if you're giving a presentation to a large audience and there's a concern about, for example, hearing impairment, then you need to talk to the organizers about finding someone who can sign for you. And we've all seen that with all the presentations, everything from politicians to doctors and so on. There's quite often now a signer in the room to accommodate that particular uh, impairment, the hearing impairment. All right. Now, I'm almost tired of saying this. If we were in class, for all the speeches except for the dramatic reading, there would be a short Q&A. I think it's very important that your audience has an opportunity to respond to you, and especially with the informative and the persuasive speech. Now, what happens if you've said something and someone gets really ticked off? Don't get in an argument. That being on stage or in a work situation where somebody becomes rude or hostile is not the place to try to deal with it. If you really ever find yourself in that kind of situation, say, I understand what you're saying. When this presentation is over, I'd love to talk to you. Do whatever you can to diffuse the situation. And of course, being prepared for a little bit of question and answer. I normally tell people that when they're preparing a speech, especially the informative and persuasive speech, and I'm just going to say, let's say there's a target time of 10 minutes. Make sure you have 20 minutes worth of material. Now, that doesn't mean I want you to go over the target time. You need to be respectful of the audience and the time that is being allowed for your presentation. But why would I say that? Well, it's because at the end of the speech, if there's time for question and answer, somebody might ask you about a point that you didn't elaborate on, and you need to be able to talk intelligently about it. I had a student once who gave a speech about sleep, an informative speech on sleep. And the speech itself was well delivered and well developed. But then we had the little Q&A at the end, and someone asked him a question. And he said, "Well, I don't know. I didn't look into that." Someone else asked him another question. "Well, I don't know about that either." It was obvious he did just enough work to put together his informative speech and nothing beyond. And it became very apparent that he was not, quote unquote, an authority on the topic. And again, I use that word very loosely. But he couldn't discuss anything beyond what he had put into that speech. So be prepared. Make sure you have enough information that you can continue with the discussion if need be. All right, and then just some rules of the road for a Q&A. Listen carefully to the questions. Obviously, allow time. Repeat the questions. That's really important, and I've seen this happen a lot, especially on television with town halls and various things, where someone in the audience will ask a question, and because of placement of microphones or whatever it might be, me as a viewer on TV or online, I don't know what the question was. And then the moderator or the speaker doesn't repeat the question. And so the answer is just sort of out there and disjointed. So if you do find yourself in a situation where you're doing that, especially in a large auditorium, it's well worth repeating the question. All right. So answer completely and offer to follow up, of course. So at the very end of this chapter, they keep coming back to the outline, and I've talked about outlining. Distill complete sentence outline to a guide that you're going to use in the speech. Well, yeah, duh. Once again, for this class, and I would highly recommend basically for any situation you ever find yourself in, I don't write complete sentence outlines. It takes a lot of time, and I can do just as well by creating an effective outline to begin with that I'm going to use in my speech. Um, uh, it says identify keywords. Well, I do that by putting them in bold, changing the colors, and then printing it out. Now it says here, transfer speaking outline to note cards. Once again, this is entirely up to you as a speaker. As I've mentioned, I gave that up years ago because I ended up with a handful of note cards. And what do you do when you're looking at a note card? Note card isn't real big, is it? And so what do you have to do? You look down at it. Also, people tend to, when they use note cards, tend to write very small on the note card, which makes it very hard to read. Tell you what, as far as I'm concerned, throw the 3x5 cards out. Stick with your outline on a piece of paper. Use large print, 14 point, 16 point if you want. It doesn't matter. Leave room between your lines. Highlight your key words, your important information. Color code it if you like. But whatever you do, print it out. Have the hard copy in front of you. Don't rely on your phone or an iPad or some electronic device. The actual outline is the best way to go about delivering your speech. So practice, practice, practice. They give some suggestions about ways to practice. You can look at that. And of course, time your speech. Make sure that your speech actually falls well within the guidelines of whatever time that you've been asked to present, the target time. So there you go. Chapter 12, a summary. It's probably useful. Again, I would highly encourage you to go back and look at some of my early PowerPoints to think about delivery methods for your speeches. Once again, hope it was helpful, and we'll be moving on to other topics here very soon. Thanks a lot.